à tous. My name is Victoria Owen, and I hold the position of Information Policy Scholar Practitioner at the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto, and I serve as chair of the Canadian Federation of Library Associations Copyright Committee. So I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on privacy, libraries, and COVID-19. On behalf of the two organizations that are jointly presenting the session, the Canadian Association of Research Libraries and the Canadian Federation of Library Associations. So I wanted to thank you for joining us today, and I'd like to particularly thank our speaker, Allison, for joining us today to speak about this very timely topic. It's important for us to acknowledge the Indigenous land on which we are situated. I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I encourage you all to take a moment to recognize the traditional peoples and the history of the land on which you live and work. So I'd also like to take care of a few procedural items. All the attendees' microphones are going to be muted by default, and the cameras are off. There will be time for questions at the end. So please enter your questions in the Q&A function, the Q&A box at the bottom. We're going to use that functionality. And please note that we're recording this session, but we're not going to record the Q&A section, so we'll turn the mic off then. And my colleague, Mark Schwartz from Carl, is joining me in the presentation of the session, and you will hear from him after the speaker. So for the sake of simplicity, we're going to be operating under the Carl Code of Conduct rules today. Carl is committed to providing a welcoming, safe, and harassment-free environment for its staff, members, committees, and working groups, as well as for participants, speakers, and organizers of Carl meetings and events. And it does not tolerate harassment of any kind. So we can share the link of the Code of Conduct in the chat box during the session. So, and now I'd like to hand the mic over to our presenter. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Allison Macrina. Allison is a librarian, an internet activist, and the founder and director of the Library Freedom Project. Allison is passionate about fighting surveillance and connecting privacy issues to other struggles for justice and the analysis of power. So I'd like to turn it over to you, Allison. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Carl, for organizing this event. I am going to share my screen and then awkwardly switch to my notes. So just bear with me for a second. We love Zoom. Okay. Now, hang on. Zoom, oops, see, awkward already. I love it. Zoom is annoying in this way where it makes it very difficult to be looking at your slides and also be looking at your notes at the same time. Mark, I can see your face. Can you just like give me a thumbs up if you can see my my slide deck and it's like full screen? Okay, awesome. I am now going to close some of my stuff. Okay, cool. And you can't see my notes, right, Mark? Thumbs up. Excellent. Okay, wonderful, wonderful. We are all just trying to adapt to this new world that we live in. So I thank you again for having me. I'm calling this talk Pandemic Privacy because why not? We live in Roni's world now. We're all just trying to figure out how to be in this new normal. Today I want to be talking about our values and what they represent in crisis times like these. What we can do specifically to defend those values and why it matters even more now. And I also want to talk a little bit about my organization, Library Freedom Project, what our mission is and how we operate and some of the things we do, and our institute for training library workers around things like privacy and intellectual freedom. And then hopefully have some questions from you all. We planned this this webinar just like a couple weeks ago, and there was a major US holiday in the middle of that. I don't know if folks know about, you know, we have Independence Day, right? So please bear with me. I threw these slides together, and this is a topic I'm very familiar with, but I got a little lazy about my slides at the end, and you will see what I mean. So I appreciate all of your patience. Just by way of getting started, a little bit more about me and who I am. My name is Allison Macrina. I am a librarian, even though I no longer work in a library, you know, once and forever, true till death, right? Like I identify as a librarian very much. I try to embody the values of librarianship in the work that I do. And Library Freedom Project is an organization that is devoted to defending library values and helping to support library workers in practical applications of those values. I am here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the US of A. Philly is on the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape. They called it Lenape-Hoking. And so I appreciate that Canadians are very good at land acknowledgements because we are not so good at it here in the US. And so the reminder to do that was important. So I'm a librarian, I'm a tech activist. I am focused on helping regular people understand the implications of technology and power, and privacy is the lens through which I have tried to get people to think about those things. But there are other issues related to access, related to personal autonomy, related to the way that we communicate and engage with each other. And I think these things are especially important as our lives have moved entirely onto the internet in the last few months and for the foreseeable future. So my organization, Library Freedom Project, here's a nice little picture of some of the members of Library Freedom Project. We once upon a time used to be able to get together in person. Library Freedom Project is essentially, it is a community of learning and practice where professional library workers take space together to think deeply about our values, privacy, intellectual freedom, access, democracy, all those wonderful things, and come up with practical ways to implement those values in our buildings and our work. There are implications for programming, for policies, for staff training, for how we engage with each other. And I think that there are a few things that make Library Freedom Project a little different than other professional development type efforts. So I think number one is that I think we are the only library professional organization that is just devoted to library ethics, the values of librarianship. I'm thinking in particular about the core values of librarianship set forth by the ALA way back in like whenever that was, 1939, and they continually update those. And we are also like a primarily based in the US, but we have an international scope. So I've worked with librarians all over Canada as well. Before I started Library Freedom Institute, which I'm going to tell you about in a little bit, I was kind of like a one-woman roadshow, visiting librarians all over the place and talking about privacy and thinking specifically about how we engage with our communities about privacy issues. And so I went all over Canada, super fun. I've also worked with librarians in Mexico, in Spain, in the UK, including, you know, not just England, but Scotland, also Ireland, other places, mostly the English-speaking world, but some a little bit broader than that. And that international approach is really important to me to build a sense of solidarity among library workers, because we are really all in this together. Our concerns, while somewhat localized, I think are very similar, and we are seeing threats to those values, threats to democracy all over the world. And so we really need each other. Another thing that I think is unique about Library Freedom Project is that our approach to values, while we are grounded in library work and in our actual buildings and our communities and our staff, we take an approach to the privacy problem that goes beyond our buildings. So, what I mean by this is we think about the implications of surveillance outside of the library doors. So like, what do they mean for people in their neighborhoods? What kind of street level surveillance is at work, by local law enforcement? What are the big tech companies collecting about us? How does the business model of the internet impact our own, personal autonomy, but also how it impacts bigger issues about democracy and freedom. And so we try to situate it very much within the library and make it practical and useful for the kind of work that we do every day, but we engage with the world in a way that I think is unique in our professional organizations. Our approach to the work is, there's a few different themes to it, right? So I've talked a little bit about autonomy. My definition of privacy is that it is autonomy. Privacy is about consent and choice, and it's really about the self, right? And what I mean by this is your ability to choose who knows what about you, what information you're sharing about yourself, I think is really central to a sense of self, right? I mean, it's sort of philosophical, but I think this is important because when people ask why privacy matters, or like, isn't privacy dead? I think that this definition can be an important challenge to that, because if we conceptualize privacy as autonomy, we tend to take it a lot more seriously. And so the other important part of this definition, I think, is that because if we think about privacy as autonomy, then we can understand better that we're allowed to make decisions about sharing things about ourselves, right? Like, I can take selfies if I want to, and I can put them on Twitter, or I can like tell the internet about different things in my life that somebody else might consider private, but that should be my choice to make. Part of the problem with the surveillance society that we live in is a lot of this is without our consent. And not just without our consent, some of it is sort of consensual. We sign terms of service and all this sort of stuff, but it's not anything like informed consent. And so I think that librarians, library workers, can have a really big impact here in the way that we not only care about privacy as one of our core values, but also in the way that we provide information literacy and education to our communities to help them understand what actually is at stake, what's happening with our technology, how is our privacy being violated, and what does that mean for us. Another one of our kind of central tenets is this idea that technology is power. Technology, like anything in the world, technology is not neutral. Neutrality is a fake idea. We knew that. Neutrality, you can just do it. There should be like a Chrome extension for the word neutrality that replaces it with status quo. It might cause some weird grammar, but I think it would be a lot more illuminating. Technology has politics. The people who build technology have politics. They have experiences in the world. They represent worldviews. And in particular, because we live under the economic system of capitalism, our technology exists to further the bottom line of profit. And so when you have technology that functions in that way, it exists to uphold a certain power dynamic. And so we try to think about all technology with this framework, right? From Google, which is a very political organization that employs lobbyists and influences politicians and helps prevent laws getting passed and get laws passed, and doesn't pay taxes and makes all these different decisions like this, all the way down to library technology, which is maybe less powerful, but still holds a place of power in our lives and with regard to our patrons. We also, in Library Freedom Project, we have these sort of big, lofty, philosophical ideas that I just went into, but we try to keep it really practical. So, what does it mean for a regular person who maybe doesn't really know much about using their computer? How can we make it something that they can easily engage with, or that we can help them engage with? What does it mean for our policies and our programs? How are we actually putting our ethics into practice? I think we're really good at talking about our ethics. We're not always so good at figuring out exactly how to make them work in the real world. We also focus on two frameworks, and I'm going to get into a little bit more later. One of harm reduction, which is exactly what it sounds like, right? Privacy is a big problem, and it's very, very hard to solve all of the issues that exist with, the surveillance society that we live in. But harm reduction matters, and taking some steps to help protect your patrons and protect yourself does have real impact. Threat modeling / having a security mindset is another framework, and I'm going to wait to get into that later because I'm already talking a whole lot. Another one of our themes is sort of connecting privacy to bigger issues of justice, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. Right now, our privacy values have to be connected with issues of health justice. There is no world in a pandemic where you can divorce these things from each other. We have to recognize the relationship that they have. Likewise, we are living in a time of massive global uprisings for Black lives. And so privacy you have to make the connection to police violence and the issues that are being raised by the Black Lives Matter movement. And so we try to have this approach in basically everything we do. We're not talking about privacy in any kind of vacuum. It has real world implications, and we try to figure out what all those intersections are. And then finally, we try to build community around privacy, because we really think that that is the best response to what the surveillance state and what big tech is doing. They want to atomize us. They want to separate us from each other. What we're living through right now with the pandemic is the world that big tech wants. They want us to be glued to our phones. They want us to not be organized with each other. It helps them because then we are, pliable creatures that can just buy more products from their advertisers. And so community, I think, is really one of the best ways that we can respond to any kind of crisis or social justice issue. If we get organized, if we support each other, even though these problems are massive, we can weather them together. And so that's what Library Freedom Institute is, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit now. So Library Freedom Project is like the overall organization, the kind of big tent thing. Library Freedom Institute is a 4 to 6 month training program for library workers that I started in about 2017. We are funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which means that we're a little restricted to library workers in the US, but we have snuck a few Canadians in. And one of them in the last round was your very own Mark Schwartz, who's here. And I would really love for us to one of the kind of follow-ups from this talk, it would be great to discuss the possibility of creating something like this for the Canadian context and finding some funding and the right people to do it. But essentially, what we're building as the Institute is this really defined community of practice. And so it's usually around like 20 to 30 librarians, library workers, I should say, who join a cohort. And over that period of time, we learn about all different privacy issues that affect us in our library work. And so I just put up a few of the things that have been in our curriculum for the last cohort and previous cohorts. We're about to start the 4th one. So Mark was in the 3rd one. We had a couple others before that. Mark's cohort started at the beginning of March. And so the whole thing was COVID shaped. We basically had to reorganize the entire curriculum to be about privacy issues that came up during the pandemic. And so, one of the biggest themes I would say is this idea of the COVIDization of technology, where enterprising technology companies and apps and startups and venture capitalists and that whole wonderful world, they all decided to pivot to health surveillance. What I have been calling health security theater, you know, so for example, something like fever detection is a good example of health security theater, because number one, we know that there is emerging, not even emerging, I would say like pretty strong public health consensus that we should treat everyone like they have been exposed to this virus, and also that lots of people are asymptomatic, right? So what does fever detection actually do? We also know that these, you know, it maybe like it might tell you something about that person, but it doesn't tell you necessarily that it doesn't tell you that everybody else is safe. And, you know, it provides new opportunities for certain kinds of profiling, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Another big aspect of the COVIDization of technology is the broad push to surveillance of labor and students. And so with regard to labor, I'm talking about both members of the working class, so people in, for example, Amazon warehouses who already were experiencing an enormous amount of surveillance in their workplaces. COVID is making everything that much more extreme, because there is an obsession from bosses and administrators right now on productivity, that, you know, no one wants to pay attention. Nobody cares. None of these folks in power care that we're all surviving a pandemic where our lives have collapsed into our apartments or our homes. We have to care for our children at home. We have to worry about our family, all these different things, not to mention the future. None of that really registers. What they want to see is that you're still working. So we see this in places like Amazon warehouses, and with truckers and other members of the working class. We also see this with fairly white collar labor, where all the applications that are being used to do work from home are now you know, doing attention tracking and reporting all this information back to bosses about whether or not you were, you know, your eyes were focused on the camera long enough and all these sorts of things. And we're seeing the same kind of thing happen with students. You know, a lot of it was already existing in the way that you know, different kinds of ed tech platforms work, but it's all becoming more extreme under COVID. Other things that we have covered in LFI include the expansion of facial recognition technology and a lot of the municipal efforts in the United States to ban this extremely pervasive and harmful tech. We've talked a lot about police technologies broadly, the kind of money that police departments have for surveillance and how they use it, and how they, because technology moves faster than the law, the ways that police have been able to use tech in contravention of our rights, but without really being detected. We talk a lot about specific digital privacy tools and strategies, so getting to that practical stuff again. We talk about influencing our local policy, how to talk to our local lawmakers and other stakeholders about surveillance issues in our communities. Of course, we talk about library vendors and library data and all the wonderful world of that. Sorry, there's a really loud garbage truck outside my house. We're all managing being in here. I'm going to shut my window. Sorry, it's a recycling truck. I guess that makes it a little bit better. And we do this training with the support of amazing guest lecturers from organizations like the AI Now Institute, from the ACLU, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the Black Movement Law Project, and of course, a number of people in the library privacy world. So it's pretty cool, I think. So, you know, thinking about Library Freedom Project and the approach that we have, and kind of like what that means for library work more broadly, I think it's important to situate ourselves a little bit in the world as it is right now, what is happening. I try not to be too cynical about things, but I think there's also a really strong tendency in the world broadly, but in libraries in particular, because we live in the world, to kind of minimize the impact of what is going on right now. Especially now that we are in, what month is it? July, and we've been living in pandemic times since March. there seems to be a broad tendency to kind of normalize, to force us to adapt, to ignore things, to get us to accept a new set of norms when we don't actually know what the future holds. We don't have all the things that we need to manage this crisis, not at a local level and certainly not at a global level. And so I think it's really important to just recognize that things are bad, and like I'm suffering and you're suffering, and that is real. Furthermore, in crisis times, that is when our civil liberties become most threatened. You know, they always tell you that just a crisis, like we just need to change some things for this crisis. And I think that we are seeing a great deal of that now. You know, I mentioned a lot of the increase in surveillance infrastructure, health security theater, you know, hastened reopenings that do not comply with public health guidelines that are fairly inconsistent or changing, you know, especially even at the global level. Exploitations of the labor force, all the things that I mentioned, all these enterprising tech companies that are pivoting to new business models. And, you know, one thing I think that is particularly frightening to me is that we have yet to experience the economic crisis stage of this, which is going to come. The austerity phase is coming. We will be forced to do less with less. We've been dealing with this kind of environment in libraries for a while now, you know, since before the economic crisis in 2008, but in particular then, and we never recovered from that. And so, you know, I think that we're going to see things get worse, and we are going to be forced to reopen under these conditions, and we'll be made to feel like we have no choice. And I think that one thing I want to say too about the other kind of global situation, the global uprisings for Black lives, we are unfortunately seeing very little in the way of those demands being met. And so I don't think that we're going to see an end to the uprising in any way, but I think what we will see is increased political repression. And so obviously my context is the United States, and things are very bad here. We're already seeing a lot of political repression. We're seeing a lot of activists being targeted, not just by local police, but by federal police, the whole like Antifa, like terrorist watch type thing. You know, people are being interrogated by the FBI when they get arrested at Black Lives Matter protests, being asked about their connections to Antifa. I think we're going to see a great deal more of this. And so this is all to say that these conditions are why it is that much more important for us to strongly defend our values and really be ready to fight for them in libraries. And, you know, we all know what those are, right? Like we believe in intellectual freedom. But let me just say something really quick about intellectual freedom. I don't think intellectual freedom means anything without a concept of justice. I don't think intellectual freedom means anything without a power analysis. I'm going to leave it at that. But like free speech is not just like some like, you know I said I was going to leave it at that and I kept talking, but I just want to acknowledge that, because it's not, you know, it's not all created equal. And I think that a lot of times our conversations about intellectual freedom in libraries don't really focus on the people whose speech is actually threatened. And so I mentioned the political repression that I think we're going to see. Those are people whose speech is actually threatened. They are exercising their right to free speech by protesting in the streets, and they are being punished for that. So anyway, at other crisis times, we have done a really good job, I think, as librarians of standing up for our values. And I'm thinking in particular of two different times. So one time, the more recent time is the beginning stages of the global war on terror. A lot of us, I think, even, you know, non-US people, I've talked to a lot of librarians around the world, and a lot of people became librarians because of the way that librarians stood up against the USA Patriot Act. And that was really significant, not just because, you know, not just for its own sake, but the fact that, you know, if some folks on this call might be too young to remember it, but the state of things was that if you were politically dissident at that time, you were completely ostracized. It was not okay to express political views that went against the war drumbeat and all the rolling back civil liberties and whatever. And librarians showed as a force and rejected this. And I think that is really extraordinary. And then the other big time that we stood up for our values was during the Cold War and like a lot of various like anti-communist repression, maybe not as well organized as our Patriot Act opposition, but certainly still significant. And we did it because we believe in our values. And I think that this is another time that we can show up and do the same thing. Another thing that I think is really important to mention about times like these, and I think we can look at those historical times and see how this has happened. All the norms that get created now, the infrastructure, the laws, the expectations, they will persist long after the pandemic. So we have to think about, what future do we want? And what we're doing now to defend that future, so thinking again about the Patriot Act stuff and the global war on terror, we didn't win that fight. We were on the right side. We came out on the side of justice, but we didn't win. What won was the surveillance state and various other things, and what we then saw, a decade later, thanks to Edward Snowden, is that all of our worst fears came true. All the technical capabilities of intelligence agencies and law enforcement that were expanded because of the global war on terror, they not only stuck around, they're still around now in 2020, but they were subject to a significant amount of mission creep. So like they got put in place to like fight terrorism or whatever. And like, that's already bad enough, because people have rights. But the way they ended up being used was for routine drug investigations for the war on drugs. We love wars in the US. And so we just picked a different one. So I really want us to be thinking about that as we're thinking about the pandemic, and where we are rightly afraid of it, and we are rightly desiring to support our communities and go back to some sense of normalcy, and to have good health outcomes, and to do everything we can to make that happen. We still have to remember that our civil liberties are important, and crisis times are when we have to defend them, and that there will be a world after this, even though it feels like there is no future. All right, so here's where I got lazy with my slides. I'm really sorry. It's just gonna be some nice text. So I wanna talk about some specific things that we can do to protect privacy in pandemic times. But I wanna start with this framework that we use in the Library Freedom Project that I mentioned really briefly, but I wanna get into it in a little bit more detail now. So we try to approach our work in Library Freedom with a security mindset and with a harm reduction framework. So I want to talk about the security mindset a little bit. And there's some really great resources that get into more depth about this. In particular, I would recommend Bruce Schneier, who is a security researcher and expert, and is very accessible in his writing. And so, if you're interested in this, you can look to his blog for more information. So essentially what a security mindset means is kind of thinking about the world as if you are gonna exploit it. And that sounds really weird, right? It's an unsettling kind of way of thinking about things, right? My security mindset would be like, okay, well, I'm here, I'm Allison Macrina, and a security mindset that makes sense for me in my life is one where I think about the kind of people or institutions that might want to do something harmful to me. So those people include like fascists, particularly on the internet where they like to live, and thinking in a security mindset, thinking about how your sort of adversaries might think, gives you a lot more insight into how you can behave in the world, what kind of precautions you should take to protect yourself, what might happen if you are unable or to protect yourself if you don't do anything. And it just opens up a lot of possibility for helping you kind of model possible things that might go wrong and then mitigate them. This is a very popular kind of framework that hackers use too, right? And to go back to the Bruce Schneier example, one story that he tells about this that I think is really illuminating is he says that, when he was a kid, they used to, he ordered an ant farm from some company and they sent the ant farm to him, and the ant farm came, but then you had to, in order to get the ants for the ant farm, you had to write your address on a little card and send it into the company. And his friend was like, wow, cool, we can get ants in the mail. And Bruce, little baby security mindset that he had, he was like, wait, you mean I can send ants to anyone just by knowing their address? So this is the approach, right? So just imagining things how something might get exploited. And this can really help us in thinking about what we want to focus on with regard to privacy, what steps we actually need to take, what is actually meaningful. It sort of separates the signal and the noise a little bit more. The other part of it, I explained a little bit, but I'll just say again, is a harm reduction approach that you can make yourself crazy thinking about all the different ways that you need to protect privacy, all the different leaks that your library has. If you do a privacy audit, you're going to find all sorts of things wrong. Having a harm reduction approach can really ease the how do I want to say this? It can help us figure out what we want to focus on and take one thing at a time and recognize that every step that we take will be meaningful, that it's, even though it's a really good thing if you solve all the problems, but you're only human and you have a library to run. So, even just rewriting one policy or offering one staff training, or maybe maybe you have once a month you do one privacy step or something like that. These are really meaningful things to do. So just want to frame it in those approaches that we have. And I want to talk about now some specific privacy strategies that some of them are really focused on the current times, the pandemic and the uprisings, but these are things that are meaningful strategies for basically any times, for any coming crisis that we might face. And I realize that we only have 20 minutes left, so I'm going to try to go through these fast because I want to have some questions. And the only reason I picked 5 is because we only have an hour and I have a talking problem. A couple things I want to say about these strategies. They are primarily about policy and best practices, not about specific pieces of technology. Part of that is because of the time, but part of it is that if you implement these policies and practices, they will influence the way that you choose technology too, and tech decisions. So first one, data minimization. This is one of the most important approaches that you can take to data that you have in the library and for the sake of your patrons' privacy. If you don't collect it, it can't get exploited later. It can't get subpoenaed. It can't get breached somehow. Data minimization is one of the most important security practices that you can take. So as a kind of framework, you should be thinking what are we collecting? And do we need to? And within that, doing something like a security audit, and I have security audit resources. I have a resource slide coming up later. Doing a security audit is a really great way to figure out kind of where you're keeping information. And so some places to look include your ILS, your discovery layer, your patron computer login software, your easy proxy logs, your databases. examining your vendor contracts and understanding how they're keeping information, looking at your own in-house policies, and what you say about your own data collection. But for the most part, you know, I think what you'll find when you start to look at this stuff is that a lot of the information that you're keeping actually doesn't need to be kept. And, you know, we have seen again and again the way that information that's collected and stored can be misused, can be abused later. And I think that, especially given the time that we're in, you know, that data is becoming more and more valuable. So that is the first kind of overarching concept. From there, you should be thinking about data security. So if you have to keep it, if you must keep it, and of course you're going to have to keep some, you need to be storing it safely, and you need to think about access control. So, you know, how long are you keeping the information for? Can you think about, can you get what you need from that data if you store it for days and weeks rather than months and years? You know, what are your policies about deletion? You know, how do you make the determination about how long things are kept? And the deletion should also include like your backups. The other part of it is who has access to the information. I no longer work in a library now, but I did for a decade. And when I worked in libraries, the ILS access in particular was wild. Anybody could access any patron record. Anybody who worked in the library, no matter what their position, no matter what need they had for looking at patron information, they could access all sorts of info. A lot of the stuff that we're, you know, we have sort of like default policies about access that make things much easier to exploit or get leaked or get misused. And so access control is a really important aspect of data security. And then finally, thinking about our policies in particular, what is our policy about requests from law enforcement? How are we keeping this data secure? How are we making sure that if we get a request from law enforcement, that we are only giving them exactly what they need to have, that we're respecting our patrons' rights? Once again, thinking about the minimization, if you don't collect it, it can't be requested, right? But if you have to collect it, be thinking about how somebody might get access to it later, and who and how that person, you know, based on their circumstances, how that might be something, a really dangerous situation to be putting them in. Another security practice, privacy practice, is getting police out of our libraries. We've talked a little bit about Black Lives Matter already. I want to talk a little bit about the connection between COVID-19 and the current uprisings. I think that some of these connections are pretty obvious. You know, Black people are the highest risk for getting COVID and dying from it, across the board. You know, in Philadelphia, where I live, if you're Black and over 75, 1% of that population has already died in Philadelphia. That is, I mean, that figure is mind-blowing to me, and we are nowhere near the end of this thing. It's 1.25% for Latinx people over 75. Black folks, people of color broadly, are the highest risk. They have a lot less access to healthcare. In North Philly, the mortality rates, the mortality rate is not the right framing for it. People have a 20-year less life expectancy in North Philly. They have no grocery stores. They have no doctors. What they do have is a great deal of access to criminalization. And furthermore, some of the COVID clusters, not some, an enormous number of them, are in jails and prisons. When I said before that we have to be connecting privacy and health justice and policing, this is what I'm talking about. So what does this actually mean for having police in our buildings? You know, number one, I don't actually think it's possible to have real intellectual freedom if we have police stationed in our buildings. People who are targeted by police, Black people, brown people, poor people, people who are experiencing homelessness, people who have various mental health needs. We know the kind of people who come into our libraries who are more targeted by police. Those people cannot have actual intellectual freedom if there are police there, because they are going to change their behavior. Not to mention, they are at risk. You having police in your building means putting people at risk of police violence, point blank, period. So, you know, what does this mean practically, police out of our buildings, right? Library Freedom Project wrote a statement about police divestment and different strategies that we can employ for making this happen. But it includes things like staff training on de-escalation. It includes building relationships with community organizations that offer support for people in need or in crisis rather than criminalization. You know, we're seeing how policing is ramping up, not just because of the uprisings and the political repression stage, people being targeted for their participation in the uprisings, but there are ways that COVID is being used to ramp up policing. You know, like enforcing social distancing is like the new racial profiling, right? And so we really need to be thinking about and engaging with what the demands in the streets are, with, you know, how we are, what we're practicing in our libraries, and what relationship it has to intellectual freedom and privacy. And I realize that this is a big ask. And I want to say that if you think that this is an extreme thing to do, even if you agree with it, even if you agree with the demands of the Black Lives Matter movement, but you're like, I don't know about this, Allison. I want to ask you, what does it mean to say Black Lives Matter? What does that mean to you? What is the practical implication of that statement? Because it's got to be more than just words. And there are clearly articulated demands that go with the movement, and we have a place in that as libraries. Oops, that's the wrong way. Another kind of broad thing, we have to refuse the kind of emerging security theater, the health security theater that's happening. We're going to be asked to do things in the name of health and safety that will probably threaten our patrons' privacy and don't actually protect anybody's health. This might include logging all of our patron visits for contact tracing. This might include taking temperatures in the front of the building, or installing biometric surveillance to check and see if somebody is hot or whatever. This is really complex, right? Because we want people to be safe. We want them to be healthy. We want our buildings to be safe places to go if they reopen, when they reopen. To my mind, the best practice here is that we should be following the expertise of public health officials, where there is a consensus about how, you know, some things are still unknown, right? But what is not unknown is that we should be treating everyone like they have been exposed. And we should take all precautions as such. We should be supporting the meaningful public health initiatives like mass testing. We need mass testing before we can even get into contact tracing. And contact tracing is important, but it's very, there's a lot of possibilities for abuse and exploitation, and so it should be 100% mediated by public health officials. Logging all patron visits for contact tracing is mass surveillance, and having that list available for somebody who wants to exploit it later is a bad idea. The other things that we should be doing are focusing on the services that we know that we can provide safely: curbside pickup, online help. If we have to open, we should limit the number of people that are allowed to come inside. We should require masks. Distributing masks at the library is cool. Hand sanitizer is good, you know. We should be prioritizing worker safety. You know, one of the things that I think is really bad about the security theater is that it does the same kind of thing that I was talking about at the very beginning, where it sort of pretends like things are normal, like, oh, we'll just slap a fever detection on it and get back to work. That is not how things need to happen here. And then the last kind of big strategy is creating a privacy culture. And so, you know, having data minimization and data security policies and getting police out, these are all part of a privacy culture, but I think there's a lot more to it, right? So in addition to policy and best practices, we need to have staff training on privacy. We need to have privacy programming for our patrons, teaching things like privacy basics, particularly like as they relate to current issues. You know, protester privacy is a really, really important issue. And it's very hard for people to get good information about this. The library is a trusted place. And so we can be meeting that information need. You know, in addition to that, like understanding COVID health data trackers, which ones are safe? You know, who's getting that information? What are the implications of sharing this information about my health with a third party? Library Freedom Project has some resources on this. I'm about to get to our resource slide. So actually, I'm being redundant now. So here's our resource slide. Just a few different ways that you can put some of these things into practice. So the first link is, we have a bunch of resources on the LFP page that previous cohort members have made. Some of them are like really, you know, basic privacy presentations. Some of them are more specific to certain issues. Some of them are like flyers. There's all sorts of different things. Likewise, on our wiki, it's a little less organized because we kind of use it as like a workspace versus the website, which is like shiny and nice and ready for the public, ready for prime time. But there's still a lot of really good stuff on there. Including like a reading list and other resources that we're working on. I have also linked to our statements on police divestment and contact tracing, which get into some of these issues a little bit more and the intellectual freedom and privacy implications of them. And then beyond Library Freedom Project, some resources that you should definitely check out if you are not familiar with them already. So number one, can't recommend Becky Yost and LDH Consulting enough. Becky is amazing. She has spoken to Library Freedom Institute a handful of times now. She does all sorts of work around library data and security and kind of like understanding the whole life cycle of your library's data. In fact, she gave a talk to Library Freedom Institute called The Life Cycle of Your Library's Data. In terms of thinking about like data minimization and data security, she's the best and you should pay her money to help your library think about these things. The ALA library privacy checklists are awesome. They cover different areas of the library from like, you know, vendor relationships to ebooks to systems to public computers, and they like, nothing is easier than a checklist, right? It's literally just a list, go down it, see where your library is with each of these steps. And then finally, Erin Berman, who is very active in the library privacy world and is, I think, is she the head of the IFC now? I don't know, she's got some intellectual freedom. I think she runs the privacy subcommittee. She's done a lot of work around privacy audits for libraries, and I have linked one of her presentations there, and I'm happy to share these slides. You can also just look for it and you'll find it. But she has done a number of library privacy audits and has a lot of great things to say about how you can do them and make them simple and easy. And then finally, I would love to take your questions. I realize that I talked until the last 5 minutes, but I'm happy to stick around longer than the hour if we need to. But here is my email address if you want to contact me or if you want to ask something that you don't want to say in front of the group. Allison with 1L at libraryfreedom.org. And I'm going to stop sharing and stop talking. And I hope there are some questions. Should I just